I'm Kevin Rebeck, President of the Manitoba Federation of Labour, and next week will be the one-year anniversary of the Manitoba NDP's election win. And we're glad to have seen this government act on many issues that are important to workers and families, like in making it easier than ever before to join a union, making workplaces safer for apprentices by restoring one-to-one apprenticeship and journey person ratios, and introducing Manitoba's first ever anti-scab legislation. But even though this government's been in power for nearly a year, Brian Pallister and his former PC government continue to call the shots when it comes to Manitoba's minimum wage, 3 years after Brian Pallister left the Premier's chair for a warmer climate. Today, we're calling on the Kinew Government to repeal Brian Pallister's minimum wage law and replace it with a real plan to make Manitoba's minimum wage a living wage. In the first year of office, the Pallister government froze Manitoba's minimum wage. It then passed legislation that only allowed the minimum wage to increase by the rate of inflation. That's a hard cap on the legislation. The law allows Cabinet the discretion to approve less than the inflationary increases, but Cabinet has no power or authority under the current law to approve an increase that's higher than inflation, no matter how uncompetitive Manitoba's minimum wage gets. Because of the one-year freeze and the fact the starting point for the inflationary increases was below a living wage level, the Pallister law ensures that minimum wage earners will never get above the poverty line, despite the fact that the subsequent Stephenson PC government had to legally override its own legislation to avoid having the lowest minimum wage in the country. Pallister's minimum wage law will never lift low-wage workers out of poverty. No one should work full-time but still live in poverty, but that's the harsh reality for far too many of Manitoba's minimum wage earners. Working families continue to feel squeezed by rising prices, and next week's minimum wage increase from $15.30 to $15.80 will still leave minimum wage earners over $3 short of what they need to stay above the poverty line. According to the most recent living wage calculation by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Manitoba, Winnipeg's living wage is $19.21. A living wage is the amount people need to earn to cover the basic needs of a family, such as rent and groceries. This is why we'd like to see the Manitoba NDP government take control of setting minimum wage and create its own plan to lift minimum wage earners out of poverty instead of allowing Brian Pallister to continue to set Manitoba's minimum wage. Manitoba's elected this government. They have the confidence that this government will do the right thing, and we'd all rather have the NDP in charge of setting the minimum wage than this guy. It's time for a new approach for minimum wage in our province, one that makes sure that low-wage workers earn enough to cover groceries, rent, and other essential costs. We know that the Minister of Families and the Minister of Housing, Addictions, and Homelessness will be consulting with Manitobans about the government's poverty reduction plans this fall. As part of this plan, the NDP government should take our province's minimum wage out of the hands of Brian Pallister and empower the current cabinet to make a difference in the lives of Manitoba's low-wage workers. It's something that Manitobans want to see. Recent polling from Probe Research shows that Manitobans overwhelmingly agree that no one should work full-time and still live in poverty, and only 10% of Manitobans think the current minimum wage is enough to live on. As the Kinew government reaches the one-year mark, we hope they'll turn their attention towards a plan to boost our minimum wage to a living wage level. We know that our Premier and everyone around the cabinet table care deeply about ensuring that low-wage workers can make ends meet, much more than Brian Pallister and his government ever did. I'm now pleased to call on Niall Harney, the Errol Black Chair for Labour Issues of the CCPA, to talk to us a bit more about a living wage. Niall?
Thanks, Kevin, for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. So the living wage is an idea that my colleagues and I at the CCPA have been researching and promoting in the public for over 15 years. The living wage is based on a simple principle. No one who is working full-time should be living in poverty. And this principle is just as important today as it was 15 years ago. The rising cost of living is putting pressure on many families in Manitoba, but particularly on low-wage workers who don't have the financial cushion to absorb price increases at the grocery store or on their rent. When we talk about affordability in this province, it's important that we talk about raising wages for workers who need to catch up with the cost of living. Now, before we get into the results of this report, it's important to remind ourselves what the living wage really is. Our latest living wage calculation showed that $19.21 an hour is the wage required for a family of 4 with 2 parents and 2 kids working full-time to afford the basic necessities like rent, transportation, childcare, food, and other household necessities. This is a bare bones budget that only covers the essentials. It does not leave disposable income for families to take a vacation, to save for a house, to pay off debts, or to provide care for a loved one in a time of need. So using $19.21 an hour as the living wage for 2023, we were able to look into who exactly in Manitoba earns less than a living wage. What we found is that close to 1 in 4 workers across the province, 24.6% of all workers, earns less than a living wage. That amounts to 171,000 workers earning less than the wage required to meet someone's basic needs. Women and recent immigrants to Canada are disproportionately represented amongst workers earning less than a living wage. Furthermore, workers who are earning less than a living wage are overwhelmingly educated and in the prime of their working years. These results run counter to arguments that raising the minimum wage will only help teenagers living at home. 43.9% of workers earning less than a living wage are between the ages of 25 and 54. At the same time, 61.3% of workers earning less than a living wage have gone through some form of post-secondary education. When the first living wage was calculated back in the mid-2000s, it was out of a recognition that many parents across the country are raising young children while working for poverty wages. The living wage is a way to ensure that families have the means to support the development of their kids. We found that 36.4% of workers earning less than a living wage had a child at home below the age of 18, making them just as likely as other workers to be supporting a child. We know that work is becoming increasingly precarious across the country. Among workers earning less than a living wage, 21.3% who are prime working age were working part-time hours. And what we found is that the most common reason for working part-time were caregiving responsibilities at home and a lack of full-time job availability. This finding underlines the need for investments in our care economy, particularly in public childcare spaces, so that everyone who wants to work can do so. Finally, we found that by far most workers who are earning less than a living wage work for large firms. 52.1% of workers earning less than a living wage work at businesses with 100 employees or more. Workers in Manitoba are struggling to get ahead of bills. When we talk about affordability in this province, we need to talk about raising incomes for the workers who do essential work day in and day out. Manitobans working at low-wage jobs need a raise, and implementing a living wage is a simple way to do that. Thank you.
Thanks. We're happy to address any questions you may have.
Let's start with the 1921 number. Just how ideally would you want to see that implemented right away instead of this 1580, or is that something you want the government to reach eventually, right?
Well, we think our principle and our stance on minimum wage is pretty clear, and it's supported by Manitobans, that when people work full-time, they shouldn't live in poverty. Of course, I'd like to see that the reality as soon as possible, but the current law, Pallister's law, leaves people systemically behind. They will never close that gap. So we'd like to see government implement it as soon as possible, and if it needed to be in 2 or 3 steps, so be it. But people are falling behind and struggling to make ends meet, no one more so than our low-wage workers.
It would be a pretty precedent-setting number, the highest minimum wage in the country. What type of impacts do you see on the business sector itself, right, having to reach this higher rate?
Yeah, well, business, I think, needs more than anything customers who have income to spend at their businesses and support them. And we know that minimum wage earners, low-wage workers, spend every penny they earn back in the local economy. We've seen this happen, these kind of large increases happen in the States and other places. And despite the fear-mongering of business that the economy is going to collapse, the opposite is true. People spend that money back in the local economy, and often those businesses do do fairly well and have customers that are there to support their businesses and keep things going. Also, employers can't have it both ways. They can't say that we can't find workers and pay poverty level wages. They need to live up to their obligation as being an employer, and in a country like Canada, there's no reason that people who work full-time should live in poverty. That has to change. Now, anything further on that?
No, that's it.
And what is the amount you are demanding for? How much percentage increase are you looking for?
I didn't do a percentage calculation of that.
A percentage, or how much do you want the wage to increase by so that people don't live in the
In poverty?
Poverty, yeah.
Yeah, well, there needs to be a significant increase. CCPA does a ton of work doing a calculation on what that figure is and comes up with it, and we support that calculation and thank the CCPA for doing that work. We think government needs to take that kind of assignment seriously, and if they need to do some similar calculations and look at what's needed so that when people work full-time and don't live in poverty, then they need to make that calculation, and then they need to make a serious commitment to get us there in a short period of time.
So that calculation is in progress right now, or will it be done after the Kinew Government plans to do it? Like, what's the plan like?
Well, there's no commitment that the government has given us that they're making that calculation. CCPA has been doing that hard work and has made that calculation and have come up with in Winnipeg it's 1921.
1921.
About that, just to be sure that I use the number properly, could you talk to us about the methodology you use for this study?
Yeah, so we use a methodology.
By the mics?
Yeah.
Thanks.
We use a methodology that's used by our offices across the country. We take 10 spending categories and we calculate what are the costs, what are the expenses that a household needs to meet their basic necessities, and those categories are rent, food, basic household items, transportation, childcare, and a few other small items. And then we look back at what's the wage required to meet that. We run it through the taxation system, and then we say what's the after-tax income that's required to meet someone's needs, taking into account the transfers that might come from government. So it's a pretty rigorous methodology, and the calculation takes quite a while to make.
Do you know what was the minimum living wage before the pandemic, for example, or 2 years ago?
What the living wage was prior to the pandemic?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head.
The Premier's, been indicating that, getting inflation under control has been a priority. He's, talking about extending the gas tax holiday as being one of the main drivers for Manitoba having the lowest rate of inflation. Wouldn't this, increasing the minimum wage by that much, have an inflationary pressure? Like, what impact would this have on inflation? Wouldn't this, just keep raising prices and exacerbate or invigorate inflation?
So not necessarily. There's a number of ways that we find in our research companies address minimum wage increases. Some part of that is maybe through price increases, but they have a lot of other ways that they address these sort of cost increases. But what we're seeing across the economy right now is workers' wages are continuing to go up while inflation is continuing to come down. It's not necessarily the case that adding wages, increasing the wages of low-wage workers is going to create inflation. There are many other factors in the economy, particularly things like the price of fossil fuels, that have a much larger effect on inflation, and those things are coming down.
And has the MFL been in talks with anybody in the NDP caucus about the minimum wage? Like, have you been lobbying for this? What's been the reaction?
Yeah, well, maybe two things. One, you asked what the cost is of doing this, and I say what's the cost of not doing it, and that means that we all pay for different social programs and ways to help low-wage workers, and there is a cost, and we do bear it when we let business get away with paying poverty level wages. This is an issue that we've raised with the government, and will continue to raise with the government. They're a year into their role and haven't made the move we want them to make yet, but we are raising this issue and will continue to push this government hard, just as we did previous governments.
Do you understand business owners who say this is not possible, we can pay them more? I mean, we have costs too, we have inflation for food also if he's owner of a restaurant. Do you understand that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the majority of minimum wage workers work for large businesses. We're talking the Walmarts and the McDonald's of the world, who can more than pay their fair share. As I spoke earlier, that minimum wage earners spend every penny back in the local economy. And I find it always interesting when some other expense goes up for business, it's the price of doing business. But when we talk about paying people a fair wage, and so when they work full-time they don't live in poverty, well, oh no, hold on, we've got to draw the line there. That's a pretty funny place to draw the line. I think workers deserve better, and that we'll be continuing to call on governments to pay a living wage. Manitobans agree. We've polled them and we've asked them this question. When you work full-time, should you live in poverty? The answer is no. The government needs to hear that and act on it to make a difference.
How concerning is it to both of you that you were talking about this large swath of the population, 25 to 54, that are falling below the poverty line? You know, we're almost losing a whole generation of people that aren't getting, you know, the Canadian dream or retiring with money.
Yeah, I mean, more and more the gap between the haves and the have-nots have been growing, and what we're saying is that minimum wage earners who work full-time need to live in poverty. We need to close that gap, and that means looking after those who make the least in our society, not continuing to cater to corporations or the most wealthy.
But what about small businesses? Like, that's still around 40% of people that are included in the study, I would guess. What's the solution for them if they're saying we can't make that? They were complaining about the increase to 15, 30.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of cuts. I think it's 50 some odd percent or over 100 employees, and then there's another over 20 employees is another significant portion. But you're right, there are some small businesses that may be struggling. Does that mean we should allow them to pay poverty level wages? I think the answer to that has to be no. Can there be some supports for small businesses who really have that need? Absolutely, there can be. But it shouldn't be some blanket rule that allow the McDonald's and Walmarts of the world to pay poverty level wages while raking in record profits. That's just wrong.
There's a lot of time you have emphasized on workers working full-time should be living under poverty, right? But it's also a fact that majority of workers that work in retail sector are also not working full-time. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, you're identifying yet another problem and another reason why the minimum wage needs to increase. More and more workers are gig workers, are working multiple part-time jobs where they no longer get access to overtime, because even though they're working more than 40 hours a week, it's not for the same employer. And that all backs up and speaks to the reason that jobs, when people work jobs, they need to make an above poverty level rate of pay, and hopefully that means they can work one job. Hopefully that means they don't have to spend their evenings and weekends working a second job just to try and make ends meet. Any other questions? Great. Well, I want to thank you all for coming today, and take care. Thanks.
Selfie booth is now open.
Feel free to pose.